Modern music tends to be very rigid in its structure. In the pop-rock songwriter world, you have the verse-chorus, bridge-chorus form, which, with slight variations, is probably 95% of the music people listen to. In the video game world, not unlike the jazz world, looping forms like AABA and ABAC rule the roost. We are very used to music built from 4 and 8 bar blocks. Turning to the classical tradition, however, we see music that allows a lot more flexibility in its form, with phrases of a wide variety of lengths stitched together with sometimes long and winding transitionary sections ferrying us from one musical idea to the next. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance has a fantastic soundtrack that takes a very classical approach to its musical forms, using transitions to weave together musical ideas with a sophistication that feels fresh and invigorating to someone accustomed to pop or rock or jazz structures. So what is a transition, and how can I use it in my writing? At the most basic level, a transition is some musical figure or section that sets up the listener to experience the music that follows. This means getting the listener in the right headspace as well as providing the context for what you're about to hear. This can be as simple as setting up the groove of a section of music before the melody comes in. The piece Battle for Hope starts off with 4 bars in a different tempo and time signature than the bulk of the tune, and so between the 4-bar introduction and the beginning of the main melody, 2 bars of the new groove are inserted before the melody comes in. These 2 bars have less going on than the A section. There's no melody to follow, and we're just sitting on the tonic A major chord. This allows the listener to focus on adjusting to the new rhythmic feel, and gives them the context to appreciate the melody that follows. Diving right into this A section after the intro would be a hectic presentation of a very calm and well-mannered melody. Setting the scene first with these 2 bars allows the presentation to fit the tone of the music. See what I mean? Doesn't this melody feel so much calmer with the 2-bar setup before it? It's funny how context can make such a big difference to how we perceive a piece of music. In this case, it's obvious that this 2-bar setup isn't a section of music in its own right. It's not part of the A section, and it's not a continuation of the introduction, it's a clear transition between the 2 parts. But this is kind of an interesting distinction in itself. How come a transition doesn't feel like a formal section of music? Take a listen to the transition that comes in a little later in the same piece, bridging the gap between the A and B section. Why is it that you would analyze this passage as the A section, a transition, and then a B section, rather than an A section, a B section, and then a C section? With even more sophisticated transitions, you can run into a situation where the transition is longer than the section it's transitioning from or to, and yet transitions have to feel like transitions. I want to draw your attention to a few factors that help create this effect: a lack of melody, a lack of harmonic stability, and odd phrasing. In the case of our groove setup transition, the lack of melody was literally the only difference between the setup and the section that followed. This later transition is a lot less sparse, but there's still no real melody, no theme that you can latch onto and sing along with. Instead, we get this repeating 3-note figure that helps outline our E7 sus harmony. This E7 sus harmony is perfect for creating a harmonic space with no sense of resolution. Dominant sus chords feel inherently floaty and unresolved, and this effect is emphasized as we jump from E7 sus up a minor third to G7 sus. This will eventually get us to the key of C major, but when this shift first hits, all we know is that we're suddenly outside of the home key and we don't know how long it'll take before we get back to some harmonic stability. We don't know how long it'll take because the music broke out of the structure of the phrasing that we'd seen so far, and I think this might be the most important factor at play here. See, the A section established an 8-bar phrase that resolved itself neatly, and then started a repetition of that exact same phrase. The second time around, though, the very last bar of the section is chopped off, and we instead dive straight into this transition. We expect the last bar here to land on the E note that ended the melody the first time around. So when this E note turns out to be the start of a brand new figure, it catches us completely off guard. Also, the full effect is kind of lost when you can see the sheet music in front of you, but changing time signatures like this is another great way to make the listener lose their footing. You don't know you're about to change time signatures the first time you listen through the piece when you're not staring at my transcription of it, so it really catches you off guard when you all of a sudden lose the beat. I think that if we'd stayed in 5/4 time and started the transition after a complete 8-bar melodic phrase, we'd have this expectation as a listener that the transition would conclude after 4 or maybe 8 bars, and it wouldn't have had close to the same effect. It also might not have felt as much like a transition, although the floaty harmony and lack of melody still point in that direction. A transition should make you feel like you're getting scooped up and thrown into the air with no idea where or when you're going to land, and even though it's not as complicated as it might seem at first, this transition totally has this effect thanks to the way it messes with the rhythm and phrasing of what we've become accustomed to. The track Undeniable Anxiety establishes an interplay between two 4-bar phrases, a beautifully harmonized woodwind melody, and a rhythmic riff presented by the horns in 3-part harmony. Towards the end of the piece, we get a 7-bar long transition section that alternates phrases based on the rhythm of the horn melody and the last bar of the woodwind melody. Pay attention to how the lack of melody, harmonic instability, and odd phrasing contributes to the feeling of motion. You could argue this transition has more of a melody than our last example, but using short single-bar fragments like this doesn't have a melodic direction the way that our earlier melodies did. And reusing elements from old melodic material is a very common move in classical era transitions. Jumping between A-flat major 7 and D-sharp 11 chords keeps the harmony totally up in the air without a resolution in sight. And notice how we had a 5-bar section with a 2-bar bass walkdown tacked on at the end. Definitely not your standard phrasing. When we do arrive back at our A section, landing on an F sus chord from a B minor 6 chord that only makes any sense in retrospect, there's absolutely no way you could say, "Oh yeah, I saw that coming." All of these elements, the lack of melody, harmonic stability, and expected phrasing, come from the goal of making the listener feel like they're in transit. And there are still other ways of achieving this effect. A big one from the classical era is the idea of writing in sequence, or taking a short musical idea and repeating it, moving up or down through some chord progression. This is a particularly common feature of Mozart's writing, but in Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, this idea is often paired with harmony that moves chromatically farther and farther away from the home key to accentuate the effect of drifting off somewhere different than we were before. A clear example can be seen back in Battle for Hope. The B section in C major that we transitioned to earlier plays out its full 8-bar phrase once, and then sets up for a repetition of this phrase. After only 6 bars, though, the music gets cut off by this quick 3-bar transition. The rhythm of the bar of melody that we would have expected to come next is used to craft a new melodic fragment over a surprise A-flat major 7 chord. Then this bar is repeated down a whole step with this G-flat major 7 chord. And then we repeat down another whole step to this E major 7 chord in a bar of 6/4 time. This leads to an A chord that sets up a chromatic resolution up to a B-flat minor 11, kicking off the next section of music. The track Painful Battle starts off with this jaunty 6/8 B-flat Lydian melody and ends up in such a different emotional place that it's hard to remember how we got there. First, let's check out the cheerful and confident A section. This is contrasted by a B section that finds us suddenly in the key of F minor, starting on a B-flat minor chord rather than the expected B-flat major chord. After just one 4-bar phrase, the repetition of this phrase is cut off almost immediately with this dramatic chromatic descent that sees stabbing chord hits and a chromatic scale run repeated in sequence down a whole step before we land back on an F chord. This is really great phrasing because this section is really 8 bars long, which on paper sounds conventional. But the way it's broken up into 4, 1, and 3 bar chunks keeps us totally guessing as to where it's going. After stewing on this next melodic section, constructed using different parts of the original A section melody and shifting between alternating A-flat and F major chords, we break into pounding full orchestra triplets over this A-flat to G-flat to F progression. Note these bass runs under the A-flat and G-flat chords because they come right back. We see this same bass figure used in sequence to outline F and E-flat chords, then a variation of this bass line moves down to outline a further descent to D-flat and finally C7. The repeated F-sus triad arpeggios over top of each bass line colors each bar differently, and the whole thing erupts into this chromatic scale walk-up that turns this phrase from a typical 4 bars in length into 5. Then, after all of that, the chromatic scale run drops us right back off at our original home key, setting up the simple groove that we'll hear underneath the main melody as we loop back to the top of the form. When this part hits every time, I think, oh right, that's where this tune started. This piece is a twisty, turny journey that keeps rocketing you up and up and up, and it's all thanks to the expert handling of the transitions. Depending on how you define it, you could almost say this piece is more transition than not. I think a lot of people outside of the classical world, myself included, are unfamiliar with the transition in music. Sure, I know of transitions, I know what they do in theory, but until checking out the Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced soundtrack, I certainly wouldn't be confident writing one into a piece. Classical music has a bit of a reputation for being more strict with its rules of what is allowed in the music, but there's so much freedom to be explored in breaking out of the conventional 4 and 8 bar building blocks that make up so much of our music, and I, for one, will have fun trying to use these techniques in my own writing. I hope you will too. Big thanks to patron Noah Robinson for suggesting this soundtrack. If you'd like to support what I do here on the channel, consider checking out my Patreon page. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.